Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the broadcast this evening. Good evening, sir.
Good evening to you.
How are you this evening, sir?
Well, actually, I won't say I'm on top of the world. That would be a slippery place to be at this time when I suspect the world is spinning around a bit faster than normally it will be with all the things, going on in Europe. It's like it's the best of times and the worst of times. So, but I'm okay. We'll see whether our friends who are with us on this platform will agree with my analysis or my observation on the state of the world at this time.
I'm sure they would, sir. I'm sure they would. Sir, this evening, I think that as has been the key topic for the last sort of 4 weeks since the war started, we've continued to see new developments. We've continued to see diplomacy evolve in slightly unconventional ways compared to what we had seen before. And I think that when we look at the situation in Russia, sir, we've seen a very key development this week that I'd like to get your reaction on. And that is the United States president attending a number of summits in Europe. Now, before we get into the details, what is your take on that move and how significant is that, sir?
It is very significant. And that's why I said it's the best of times and it is the worst of times. Best of times in the sense that we are seeing multilateral diplomacy at its best. COVID-19 gave us diplomacy by Zoom. And somehow the war in Europe, and here I am agreeing with the president of Ukraine, that we should stop calling it the Russian-Ukrainian war, that it is a European war. And what the rest of us are praying is that it will not be a world war, that it will simply stop at being a European war. And, here you have 3 major summits in one European city, all focusing on one issue. And here is the American president who normally will not be stretched this far and will not be stressed. Because you're talking about an old man. It doesn't matter. The briefs he's been given, he is still an old man. And here he is. And he's also going to go to the war front. And I believe this is the first time, if my memory serves me right, where an American president will be going to a war front pre-announced before anybody calls me out for forgetting visits to Afghanistan and Iraq. All those were usually announced after the president will have taken off. But this is the one that has been pre-announced that he will be visiting Poland. And Poland is on the war front. I wouldn't want to be the head of the Secret Service detail, they must be tearing their hair out as to how do we get this man in and out safely on board Air Force One and on his way back to Washington. And then we're also, and I then said, of course, the worst of times. But let me bring out one more issue on the best of times, even if though it's going to sound oxymoronic, that one will be talking about sacrifice involving death as being part of the best of times. I shift it into the best of times column because honestly, it brings out, presumably to those of us who are not really right there on the forefront, what I will call what the soul of man is capable of. I don't know how many of us on this platform will know what it takes for you at the age of 28, or maybe 30, maybe even 35, to kiss your baby and your wife goodbye, or even take them across the border into Poland, kiss them goodbye there, and say, I am going back to fight for my fatherland. We are going to, I mean, I hope the young scholars and those who are bringing up the young scholars will probably, invite those young scholars to look at the concept of fatherland. What does it produce in a human? What is this? They used to think that it's we Africans, who are attached to the village, attached to the land, and here you have Europeans being so attached to the soil, to where their parents and grandparents are buried, and say, I'm going back to defend where my parents or grandparents are buried. The essence of, I know it was Putin, who surprisingly was quoting the Bible. But as usual, the devil can quote the Bible to justify its own means. When he said, greater love, has no man than to give your life in defense of your friends or your family or your fatherland. But actually, it is more the Ukrainians who have impressed the whole world. You even see, there was a lady soldier. I'm not being sexist here. I just want to say that the sacrifice we are seeing is not just from the men alone. There was a lady who gave her little child to her own mother to help her take care of, took them into Romania, and then having handed the baby over, turned around to say, I'm going back to join my husband in fighting for our land. I've never seen such outpouring of sacrifice. I have never. But then on the other side of the coin, the worst of times is the carnage that one sees, the destruction of buildings, of business, of human beings, whether Russian or Ukrainian, and when those journalists who are there, when they run their commentary, at times I shiver where I am sitting. So but I also must say, at the end of the day, you find that there's nobody coming up who believes there is a solution. That's the ultimate question that the journalists always ask, whether it's Biden they are asking, or even the Russian foreign minister they are asking, what is the solution to this? Oh yeah, they've all come up with the form of words, and we diplomats are very good at coming up with the form of words that, well, we are very sure that when Putin comes to his senses, he will listen to, that. Supposing he doesn't come to his senses, I see at the end of the interview or the end of the day or the end of the conference, I don't see anything to make me positive and be optimistic that this. Do you know they were talking about in 6 months' time? Maybe we will be meeting in Brussels. 6 months. What will be left of Ukraine? Yes, they are pouring the weapons there. Fine, but everybody else is asking the Ukrainians to fight, not to the last European, but to fight to the last Ukrainian to defend. What is going to be Ukraine without Ukrainians? I ask you.
There's a question here on YouTube, sir, and this person wants to know that given the news of deflections by Russian forces to fight on the Ukrainian side, are we starting to see a defeat for Russia in this war?
No. What we are starting to see is a demystification of Russia as a world power. It still has a powerful military force, but it's probably the military force that can destroy, not that can conquer and occupy. Obviously, we have over-exaggerated the strength conventionally of the Russian soldiers in foot. We've demystified, we have over-exaggerated how powerful they are. But in terms of their air force, in terms of their inter-ballistic missiles, they are still capable of enormous damage. And that's what we are starting to see happening in Ukraine. However, there are two factors we should start looking at now that may be the beginning of the end of Putin. I said the beginning of the end of Putin. You've drawn attention to one, which is soldiers, if it is true, because again, as I always warn us on this platform, there is a lot of, propaganda, exaggeration, misinformation, and so on. But if it is true that soldiers are defecting, Russian soldiers are defecting to the other side, and one advisor, one close advisor of Putin has actually defected, has resigned and left Russia. And there are also Russians who are against the war, who are going into Turkey, and Turkey is giving them asylum. And Russia and Putin is asking for, Belarusian soldiers to come to his aid and assistance. Then this may be the beginning of the end, not the end of the beginning of the end, which means we may still be a long way, because dictators don't get overthrown overnight. If we know what is happening within Russia, he himself then already will know. So it's probably better that we don't know the extent of disaffection within the cabal that surrounds this same oligarchs that they've been hitting. But it's getting close home, because Putin is starting to call them traitors. They are leaving the they are leaving Russia. They are looking for asylum with their money already stashed over the place. They are defecting from him. By the time he starts calling them traitors, he's drawing attention to the disaffection within Russia itself.
But sir, when I know you've called it the beginning of the end, but one key point over the last few days has been the number of very senior military officers of the Russian army that have been confirmed killed in the war. And the question is, for how long, how much longer can the Russian army sustain that type of loss and still be able to operate at their capacity as a strong military?
It must be warning to Putin and to the Russians. I think the last count is that 5 generals have died, have been killed. This will raise an issue for military strategists, because generals are not supposed to be at the war front. The war front will usually be captains, majors, who will be carrying out the war plan, while the generals are, in the war room. But I know that the Israelis like their generals to fight from the front. So is this a question of the Russians starting that strategy at the beginning in Ukraine? Senior officers, you lead from the front. You will give, that will give, the soldiers who are behind you, give them some courage as they go into this, which will mean that actually it is true that the soldiers which he initially sent into Ukraine were recruits, not soldiers trained in battle, whom you could then entrust to, majors and lieutenant colonels. So the generals have to then be up front there. But how many generals can he afford to sacrifice that way? And this may then explain what people were wondering about, why they thought they would overrun Ukraine in 1 week. This is the beginning of the 2nd month, and they've captured only 1 city. They haven't captured, so the success rate of the Russian army in Ukraine is very low. And that may also explain why he's inviting the Belarusians, he's inviting even Syrian fighters, to come and join in fighting in Ukraine. When you look at the size of Russia and our assessment of its military might and the size of Ukraine and our knowledge of its military, this lack of the strength of Ukrainian military, and yet it is holding its own, pushing back in some places, then maybe, but let me again, and I will it will be another factor I'm adding to the beginning of the end of Putin. Don't forget that it was the defeat of the Russian army by the Germans during the First World War. It was the defeated Russian army that came back to what then was Russia to carry out the revolution. That's how first the Mensheviks and then the Bolsheviks, the Communist Party, had the revolution that led to the Communist Russia and the Communist Soviet Union ultimately. So, I mean, history has ways of repeating itself, but it's not something that will happen overnight. But all these factors put together, if I were Putin, I may be checking with my travel agent for where can I find a safe haven.
So let us dissect some of the comments from the US president at the NATO summit today in Brussels. So we had more sanctions. We had what has happened. He said clearly Russia did not expect that the West will be as united as the West has been. He even went as far as talking about China and telling China, stay out of this. How do you respond to the highlights of the messages from President Biden following the summit? Were they strong enough? Did they propel the United States back as in control of this situation? What are your thoughts on this, sir?
I think that Biden has handled this issue quite admirably. He has succeeded in still keeping the unity of NATO intact. Although he's not, the United States is not a member of the European Union, but one of the consequences of the unity of NATO has also been the commitment of the European Union and of course also the G7, the main economic powerhouses of the Western Bloc. Let us call it that way. And this is diplomatic tactics at its best. And I think his policy advisors, should be congratulated, at least on the achievement of that objective. Number two, the military commitment of the key European countries to NATO has been solidified and even increased. And the one that we should in fact be focusing on is not France, it's the Germans. I think we have seen the end of the German phobia about their responsibility for the Second World War. Finally, I think they have shed that. The commitment to submit, to supply weapons to Ukraine, the massive increase in the budget to the military in Germany shows the Germans are back. Just like Biden says, America is back. I think the Germans are back on the European scene as a major and critical player. And thirdly, the NATO presence in Europe is more actualized now than it was before. Before, yes, the troops were there, and they usually had an American commander of the troops, while Europe will provide, the Secretary General of NATO. But since this problem started, look how many, what I will call boots on the ground units, they are now setting up all on that eastern flank. Even at this summit, they committed themselves to another 4,000 troops that are going to be brought in. Not to talk about the Air Force, whose strength is being increased, and now they're bringing in submarines and this, what do you call this, naval ships where planes take off. They are bringing them in as a task force to show a presence. So there is no doubt that if anybody had any doubt about the usefulness of NATO, he's just got his answer, that NATO is here to stay. And before, people have said, once the Soviet Union disintegrated, why did NATO not disintegrate? Well, that's a question for yesterday. Now, that question is irrelevant in terms of the future of NATO, or in terms of how useful is NATO. The Europeans have committed, they are committing funds, they are committing troops, and the United States is flying more troops. So let's say, we're fine. We know the danger we are facing from Russia. This is our answer. The one that worries me, and I like the way Biden and NATO have played it, is this issue of what's the answer to Russian threat to use chemical and bacteriological weapons. They've played their game carefully. They haven't said precisely what they are going to do. They are leaving Putin guessing. Will America itself use, in retaliation, will it use chemical weapons? My own feeling is that no, because that would be against international law. And well, as some of you say, two wrongs don't make a right. So I'm not, Mr. Moderator, I'm not calling you out on this. But it's going to be a crisis of the soul for the Western Alliance, how they will deal with the use of chemical or bacteriological weapons. They may decide that fine, they will now, because those things are delivered, either by Air Force or by ballistic missiles. They may decide that they will actually hit the sites where those missiles are taken off, and engage the Air Force, the Russian Air Force, which they have been very, very careful not to do. But I think that we may be getting just to that red line. I listened to the wording, the physiology of Biden. Biden is not noted for being careful with his words. But even on this, all he said is Russia will get an answer. He didn't. There was one of the reporters who tried to press him on what kind of an answer, and he started giving an answer and then he backed off. So we from now on, really, we shouldn't sleep with our two eyes closed, We shouldn't. All of us, not just you people who live in Europe, the rest of us also.
Sir, there is just a quick point to someone who has put a question on YouTube here. You're saying that has Prof considered the historical push behind Putin in terms of fascism? Can you please clarify exactly what you mean by that question? Because I'm not sure I understand it. And I would really love to put your question to Prof. So if you don't mind, if you can just clarify exactly what you mean by that question, and then I'll come back to you. But sir, there's another question here on YouTube, and this person is referring to some military trade that's taking place between an African supplier based in Nigeria and Belarus, and what implication would that trade have on Africa as a whole?
Yes, I am aware that there is a factory or an industry here in Nigeria that makes first-class military hardware, and they've supplied those hardware to some ECOWAS countries, so even they supplied to some of United Nations operations. They've supplied also to the Nigerian army this equipment. I'm also aware that Belarusia had a contract with Belarusia to supply this military equipment to them. And it's rather unfortunate that it is now at the point of executing the contract that you now have the involvement of Belarusia in the war that's going on between Ukraine and Russia. Now you will now understand at times why what we have criticized in the past, which is the global north breaking contracts. It's been done to us in Africa, where the United States have said, yes, you've paid for these Air Force planes, but because of accusation of a human rights violation, we will not supply these planes to you, and we will not refund your money. This puts Nigeria on a spot because it's only the Nigerian government actually that can freeze the execution of that contract. Even though the Nigerian government is not a party to it. This is a private company, a very successful private company, having a contract to supply this military equipment to Belarus. I think doctrine of necessity or force majeure, the Nigerian government, I think, should simply not allow the contract to go through. That is my own reading of what is at stake. It's just too dangerous.
So there's another question here, a very interesting one. And this person is talking about the fact that if we cast our minds back to World War I, World War II, and the role that Germany had to play in that, should we be worried that Germany is now committing more funds and significantly more funds to arming themselves and bolstering their defense capability?
Yes, we should be worried, but not only about the Germans. If there is one point on which I think Putin has made has made a case, it is about the resurgence of fascist right-wing forces in Ukraine. But these fascist right-wing forces are all over the global north. Recall Nazi flags, Nazi symbols parading the streets of America when Trump was in power. And he never condemned them. He did it. In Europe, I've seen those flags. We've had demonstrations, anti-COVID-19 demonstrations. And I've always been surprised to see Nazi symbols. And I've asked myself, what has Nazi symbols got to do with vaccination of COVID-19? But it is evidence of a resurgence of right-wing fascism. It's manifesting itself all over Europe, including Britain. So it's not just the Germans we should be worried about, is how do you address, it's manifested as populism. This is the way, the polite way. When people don't want to talk about fascism, they say it's populism, the force of the people who turn emotional on issues and desire and have no respect for already laid down procedure about how you resolve conflicts. Is it 2 or 3 MPs in Britain have been killed, including a lady MP who was killed while she was going to address her constituency. And a case is starting at either today or so of somebody who killed another MP. These are manifestations, because this is the way Hitler started terrorizing the established opposition. established government institutions, calling it people's power. That's a phrase I always dread, people's power, because anything can be called the people's power. And does that justify murder, assassination, and what have you? So I just didn't want my answer to focus on Germany alone. There are, Italy is one of them, but I understand, because the Germans have carried the opprobrium of World War I, World War II. We should be afraid of their capability to give credence to people's power.
So there's another critical point that I want to put to you, and this one is going all the way to something that happened that the president of the prime minister, of Pakistan said. He called on major and majority Muslim nations to intervene in the war between Russia and Ukraine. But he also did this at the OIC meeting, Organization of Islamic Cooperation meeting, for which the Chinese foreign minister also attended, first time in 57 years. My question is this, sir. Do you agree with the comments of the Pakistani Prime Minister? And how significant is it for China to attend that event at this point in time?
My life as a foreign minister of Nigeria and the crisis of our admission into the OIC is flashing before my eyes as you are raising that question. I don't like religion being introduced into any crisis. Political crisis can be resolved by negotiation. Religion is a question of beliefs. Beliefs that are so entrenched that it becomes haram. Another haram in any attempt to change a belief or your interpretation of a belief. And to me, it creates another major, in fact, it turns a political crisis into something else. So while I can understand, while Imran Khan, the president of Pakistan, will advocate that perhaps Muslim countries, some Muslim countries should get together, I will say, since neither Ukraine nor Russia is a Muslim country, and given the problem that Russia is keeping an eye on its Chechen population, they should be kept out. I would rather a non-religious multilateral group of nations with credibility in international arena, people who already have a reputation for taking part in peacekeeping operations. I would rather that those are, the people who should, I said this last week. I don't know if you recall. Let the president of Brazil pick up the phone, call the president of South Africa, call, maybe, because you see, you can't call anybody in Europe now. Europe now is an active participant. Forget being neutral. It's an active participant. So there's no, before the UN used to call on Sweden and Norway and these other countries, to step in. Now we should be, it is the global South actually that I think mediators will come from. And to me, I think it's a no. Why would China be an observer at the conference? I think the Chinese have a problem now domestically with their Muslim provinces. And I expect that China needs, or China wants to use the OIC as one of the instruments to diffuse its own Islamic problems within China. And if Imran Khan had said that the OIC should assist to mediate between China and, its Islamic Asian communities, provinces, I would understand that. But I think the presence of the foreign minister of China at the OIC is understandable, given the need for China to diffuse its own problems, domestic problems, with its own Muslim provinces.
Thank you, sir. Someone has put a question here, which I think you have dealt with, sir. And the person wanted to know if Putin could be holding back his more experienced troops and has only just put forward the less experienced ones. And I think you have dealt with that, sir. I think you've dealt with that already this evening. So I will skip that question there. But I just wanted to acknowledge the person who put that there. Sir.
I'm so sorry. The implication of that question could be not too fast. Don't run down your perception of Russian military capability just because the recruits are not performing as well. Maybe the more seasoned ones are still available, are still in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, in Siberia, and they could still be let loose. It is possible that, to me, that's the implication of the question that is being raised. And that is possible, in which case, but if that is the situation, why would Putin be calling on Syrians to me, the fighting capability of Syria is, has it been put to a test? Who said that they will be any better than the recruits that he has sent forward? Who says?
Thank you for that, sir. One other question before, I see we've got 7 minutes. I want to ask you about Madeleine Albright that passed on. But before I do that, I want to ask one last question, and this is going to Syria and the fact that right in the middle of this war, we've seen the relationship between Syria and the UAE, Abu Dhabi specifically, kind of start to build. Assad has been to visit the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, and some are crediting this to Russia. What is your take on this, sir?
Assad's interests are by far much larger than just being an errant boy of Putin. You asked me a question on this platform about, I don't know whether it's 6 months ago, but we were talking about Africa, that, how will Africa be able to pull itself out of this control syndrome by the global north? And I replied that it's probably when the global north is so enmeshed in its own problems that we will seize that opportunity to rebuild our own house. And that is what I suspect Assad is doing. To say, look, I'm not involved. There's another bigger war going on. I'm not involved in that. It's not an Arab war. Let we Arabs, let us again try and create, seize this situation when a war going on doesn't involve us, to rebuild our relationship. And it wouldn't need permission from Putin to do that. Would the UAE do this without winks and nods from the Saudi Arabian government, especially the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia? I suspect not. I think we are starting to see a rebuilding of Arab relationship. And don't forget, I think we've discussed it on this platform, Iran having meetings as well with some Arab countries. This is about 6 months ago. So look out for developments in different parts of the world. They wish America and wish Russia well while they talk to each other as brothers.
Thank you, sir. Let's talk about Madeleine Albright, the first woman U.S. Secretary of State that's just passed on. How do you think she'll be remembered, sir?
She was a controversial figure. She was a United States Secretary of State, and she believed in promoting and advancing American interests. Of course, that was her job as American Secretary of State. Number two, she was a hardliner, a firm believer in the use of force to back up diplomacy or to even promote diplomacy. It showed in her being able to finally persuade President Clinton, whom she served, to use American Air Force to end the civil war that was going on in Yugoslavia. Of course, when people die, you don't want to talk about some of the less than positive things that they themselves may not want you to remember. But she was a harsh proponent of sanctions against Iraq that led to the death of thousands of Iraqi children. And when this picture was showed to her, that this is the consequence of American, sanction against Iraq, that children are dying, lack of milk, lack of medicine and so on. She said, well, she felt bad about it, but hard decisions have to be taken. Can you imagine if Putin were to say that now, confronted with pictures of Ukrainian children dying and saying hard decisions have to be taken? But she never changed her mind, and they never removed that sanctions against Iraq. It's strange, although it is understandable, that a first-line diplomat who is supposed to be an apostle of peace will believe so much in the use of force, while Colin Powell, who was the #1 American military man as chairman, Joint Services Chiefs, in control of troops, believe that diplomacy should first be your first line of choice. And they clashed. They clashed. She, as Secretary of State, saying, why are we spending all this money on American troops if we are not going to use them? And Colin Powell replying, we spend all this money training these boys, but they are still people's children, not to be used at the first snap of the fingers. But I could understand where she was coming from, because she was a refugee from Czechoslovakia during the Second World War, who was admitted by the United States. So she probably sees every dictator against the background of her own refugee status and what she ran away from. And therefore, it's got to be. She supported the expansion of NATO at the time when people like Kissinger, what's the name of this former Secretary of Defense, and even the CIA director were arguing for caution that this may irritate and spark off retaliation by Russia. She was one of those who was pushing for, and here's the result now. Here is the result. So really, may her soul rest in peace. That's all that I can say. But she was an effective foreign minister. And those of us who are in the field with her, although I didn't meet her personally and I didn't interact with her personally, but still, she was a player in that global field.
Thank you for your time this evening, sir. I think we have run out of time. We will be back here to our viewers as usual next week, Thursday. Thank you all for all your comments that came in today. Always very helpful when the comments come in. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and share the links when you get the links from Prof. Please do share those links. But don't forget to subscribe, like the channel, and let's get more people on here as well. Thank you very much, sir. And we'll be in touch again next week. And bye to our viewers.